Hi, my name is Pratap and I'm going to show you how I processed this image of the Orion, Running Man, Flame and Horsehead Nebulae using Lightroom, Affinity Photo and Photoshop. I shot 26 light frames using a full spectrum Sony a6100, a Rokinon 135mm lens at f2, 25 seconds and ISO 400. A full spectrum camera is one in which the hot mirror in front of the sensor is removed. That is why these images have a reddish tint. The sensor sees the full spectrum of light, including UV and IR. A normal camera with a hot mirror in front of the sensor cannot capture the deep reds in the Orion Nebula. The way I have framed this image, I was able to capture not just the Orion Nebula, but also the Flame and the Horsehead Nebulae. To process this image, I will first have to correct the white balance in Lightroom. Then I will stack the 26 light frames in Affinity Photo. Then I will export a 32-bit TIFF file and import it into Photoshop, where I will enhance the colors and contrast. Finally, I'll import the TIFF file into Lightroom, where I'll do the finishing touches. To begin processing this image, I'm going to shift to the Develop module in Lightroom. To correct the color cast, I'm going to use the White Balance Selector tool and sample an area of the image which I know is white in color. This star on top is a good subject to sample. When I click it, the color cast in the image disappears. Now that I've corrected the white balance, I can synchronize the settings with the rest of the 25 images. Now, all images have the same white balance. As I cycle through these images, you can see that the position of the stars and the nebulae has moved. I mounted the camera on a star tracker and shot these images over a period of about 1 hour. I'm going to export these images as TIFF files and stack and align them in Affinity Photo. Let me select all images and hit Export. I'm going to put the TIFF files in a folder called TIFF, and my TIFF settings are as follows: color space ProPhoto RGB and bit depth 16 bits per channel. I'm not going to resize these images. Lightroom will take a short while to export these TIFF files. Meanwhile, let me open Affinity Photo. I'm using version 1.10.4 of Affinity Photo. Okay, the TIFF files have exported. Let me go to File, New Astrophotography Stack, and in the Files tab, I'm going to click Add Files. Next, I'm going to select all the 26 TIFF files and click Open. In the Stacking Options panel, I'm going to change Sigma Clipping to Mean. Sigma Clipping works well for raw images shot over a long period of time. Mean works well for captures such as mine, which were shot in less than 1 hour. Next, I'm going to click Stack. The process of stacking takes a good amount of time, and I'm going to speed up this video. Okay, Affinity Photo has stacked 26 light frames. I'm going to hit Apply to complete this process. When I zoom into the image, I can see that Affinity Photo has done a great job of aligning the 26 frames. The stars appear as pinpoints of light. There is a streak of light, probably caused by a plane moving at night. I can fix that in Lightroom later. The colors and the exposure of the nebulae look great as well. However, there is this horrible green cast in the image which we will fix. Affinity Photo has added some basic curves and levels layers. I'm going to uncheck those layers. And this is how the base image looks like. Now I select the levels layer and then the curves layer. The image has a horrible green cast which we're going to remove next. For that, I will select the base layer, go to Filters, Astrophotography and Remove Background. I get this dialog box, and in the bottom there is a split view option which I will click. I can move the split view to see the before and after. I'm going to move it all the way to the right because I want to see more of the after. There is also a handle which I can move around on the image. I'm going to select an area of the image that has no stars. I'm going to click Sample Color at Handle. Affinity Photo instantly removes the color cast and makes the background black. I can increase or decrease the black level by moving the output black level slider. I'm going to move it to the right because I don't want the image to be very contrasty. And then I'm going to hit apply. With that, our edits in Affinity Photo is done. I'm going to save this image in the Affinity Photo format. I'm going to call it Orion Nebula Stack. And then I'm going to save, and then I'm going to export this image as a PST file. The PST file is going to be a 32-bit file. Okay, Affinity Photo has exported the PST file and I have opened it in Photoshop. If I go to mode, I can see that it is a 32 bits per channel image in RGB color. A 32 bits per channel image means that a lot of filters are not available to us and a lot of blending modes are not available. I'm going to start my edits in Photoshop by trying to recover some of the highlights that are blown out due to the curves and levels layers added by Affinity Photo. I'm going to be using masks and adjustment layers extensively in Photoshop. Let me zoom into the image, uncheck the topmost layer and add a white mask to the middle layer. Next, I'm going to select the brush tool and set the foreground to black. I'm going to set the opacity to 50 and gently brush on top of the mask. By doing so, I'm revealing the layer under the middle layer. If I think I have gone overboard with the masking, I can undo my brush strokes, or I can change the foreground to white and paint over the areas that I had painted black earlier. This is the before and this is the after. Using the brush tool requires very gentle strokes. As you can see, I have recovered the highlights in the center of the Orion Nebula by adding a mask. Next, I'm going to select the topmost layer and repeat the process. I'm going to add a mask, use the brush tool with the foreground set to black and an opacity 50, and I'm going to gently paint on top of the mask to reveal what's below that layer, which is the layer that we had just masked. With a few brush strokes, I can recover the highlights once again. Before, after. Next, I'm going to increase the intensity of colors in all these nebulae. For that, let me go to 100% again, and let me go to the channels tab and then select the blue channel. Now when I hold the Command or Alt key and click the channel thumbnail, I get marching ants. The marching ants have selected all these areas which are white or close to white in the image. Next, I go and add a hue saturation adjustment layer. Now the layer that I added already has a mask applied to it, and the mask is such that everything else which was not selected is black and what was selected is white in color. Now I can go to the reds and increase the saturation. So only the red channel saturation has increased. I can even change the hue to make it slightly more pinkish. Likewise, I can go to the yellows channel and increase the saturation of the yellows. This effect is subtle but obvious. Next, I'm going to select the reds, go to layers and repeat this step. This time I'm not going to increase the saturation a lot because it has already been increased. Okay, I have done some basic color enhancement to this image. I can make further color enhancements using curves. For that, I can select the entire RGB channel and then open curves and then add a curves adjustment layer and increase the saturation of only the highlights a little bit. As you can see, I have increased the reds in the Orion Nebula quite a bit. Let me group these layers into a group and call the group color enhancement. Now by turning this group on and off, you can see how much of red I have brought in to the nebula. If I think that this is too intense, I can always reduce the opacity a little. Next, I'm going to try and brighten the Flame and Horsehead Nebula. For that, I'm going to use the elliptical marquee tool with a feather of 300, which is a pretty high number. And I'm going to select just these two nebulae. Next, I'm going to add a curves adjustment layer and gently increase the exposure. Because space is full of gases, there is a strong red color tint around these nebulae. So to remove that, I'm going to use a brush, and this time with my foreground set as black, I'm going to gently remove some of this curves effect from around the two nebulae. Here is a before and after. Before and after. Before, after. Before, after. I can do the same with the Orion Nebula. Use the elliptical marquee tool with a feather of 300. Make a selection. Introduce a curves adjustment layer, and this time I'm going to use the click and drag option in the curves panel to make sure that I don't blow the highlights. So my first click is going to be on the highlight, and my next click is going to be on the slightly dark part of the nebula. And then I'm going to gently push my mouse up to increase the brightness of the nebula but protect the highlights within the core of the nebula. And this is the before and after. I'm going to group these two layers and call them exposure enhancement. Now when I turn this group on and off, you can see the difference between the before and after. Next, I'm going to try and darken the space between these nebulae because I feel it is slightly on the less contrasty side. So for that, I'm going to introduce an adjustment layer, a curves adjustment layer, but this is going to be a global adjustment. So I'm going to gently bring down the blacks and then increase the contrast a little. And this is the before and after, before and after, before, after. I'm going to bring back some of the effect from the core of the nebula, the Orion Nebula, by using the brush tool and having a foreground color of black and opacity of 50. Just one dab here, one dab here, one dab here, and one dab here, and one dab here. Because the contrast reduced some of the highlights in the nebulae. This is before and this is after. This is before and this is after. I think at this stage I am done. Maybe one last boost of hue and saturation. Again, a global change just to see what I can do or how much I can push this image. Yeah, so obviously this is way overboard. So let me reduce the opacity and just keep a 20% opacity. A very, very subtle change. That also increases the saturation in the stars. Okay, now we are done in Photoshop. Let us save this image as a TIFF file because this is a 32-bit image, and to be able to import it into Lightroom, I have to save it as a TIFF file. So I'm going to click Save and save it as a 32-bit TIFF file with an image compression in the zip format. Now that the TIFF file has been saved, I'm going to drag and drop it into Lightroom to import it. And I'm going to make sure that I'm adding it and not moving it. I'm going to click Import. And here is the file in Lightroom. Remember, this is a 32-bit image. When I compare it with my Photoshop image, it is slightly more contrasty. And that's because Photoshop is not able to render the 32-bit image correctly. But this is what it is. This is our image in Lightroom. And let's go into the develop module and lessen the contrast a bit, because this is a little too contrasty compared to the Photoshop image. We can do that by pushing the blacks slider, by decreasing the contrast, and I feel that the stars are a little too yellow, so I can push the temperature slightly to the left towards the blue, and that also makes the outer part of the nebula a little blue. And I can play around with the tint to see if I can reduce the green color cast. Remember, all of these are global adjustments. Or I can just use the white balance tool and select a neutral part of the image, which is this star, which is white in color. All right, next I'm going to try and reduce the highlights of the Orion Nebula by using a brush, and I'm going to start by painting over the nebula and decreasing the highlights. While I'm at it, let me also increase the dehaze to give some clarity and texture to the gases in the nebula. Let me click done, and let me do the same with the Horsehead Nebula and maybe even the Flame Nebula. So I'll introduce a new mask with the brush, paint this part of the image and increase the clarity, texture and dehaze. Click done, and next I'm going to crop the image so we see more of the nebulae and less of empty space and stars. And maybe the contrast is a little less, so let me bring back some of the blacks and increase the contrast a tad bit. Now this is looking good. I can set my white point by clicking Option and moving the white slider till it starts clipping on the right side, which is somewhere here. I'm not going to try and set my blacks because I know that it's probably already clipped, and anyway we have increased the blacks over here. Next, let's add some sharpening. I'm going to be generous with the sharpening, add a sharpening of 70, but I want to sharpen only the stars and the nebulae. So I'm going to use Option again and move the masking slider till I know that the sharpening is applied only to the stars and the nebulae. So I'm going to stop the masking slider somewhere here, which is about 70. So again, these are subtle effects that you may or may not be able to see when watching the video. Let's fix this streak of light. For that, let's use the spot removal tool, which is built into Lightroom. Let's click one end of the streak and then the other end of the streak. And Lightroom has removed the streak, but it has introduced some artifact here. So I'm going to undo it, make my clone tool much smaller and repeat this process. There you go. So this is the before and this is the after. I have lost a star here, but that's okay. I mean, if you want to bring back that star, you can repeat this process, but by avoiding the star. So yeah, here we are. This is our final image. You can see that the Orion Nebula is looking great. All the gases in the nebulae are all brought out beautifully. yeah, as one last step, you can add some noise reduction, maybe 20% or 30%. That's purely optional. And let's see it in full screen. So here is the final image.